The second time I woke up drugged in that hotel bed, the woman my family had raised me to hate was asleep on my arm, Vera, heiress of the house we'd been at war with for a decade, breathing slow against a shoulder she'd have broken if she were awake. 10 years of being told to despise her, and the instruction never quite took, mostly because I'd watched her gut a boardroom full of older, richer men using 3 sentences and a smile she couldn't be bothered to finish, a mind that read a room like a ledger and always circled the number everyone else was hoping you'd miss. The face was its own separate problem. She was beautiful the way a well-made knife is beautiful, best admired from across a table, which was roughly the opposite of where I currently was. Last life, I did the sensible thing, I ran. Which is exactly why my stepbrother Julian was waiting in the hall to pour her into a different bed, sell the photos, and let the story tell itself. Vera ruined, married off to him to save face, and me erased from the family for disgracing the alliance I existed to secure. So this time I didn't run. I locked the door, switched on the room's own cameras, poured the drugged wine into a clean glass for the lab, and shook the enemy awake, because the one person in that building with more reason than me to bury Julian was the woman he'd planned to frame next. Let me back up, because the second time is doing a lot of quiet lifting in that sentence. The first time I lived 5 more years. I want to be clear that they were not good years. I was disowned by lunch the next day, financially dismantled by the end of the quarter, and, in a genuinely impressive display of follow-through, murdered on a Tuesday for a warehouse fire Julian set and signed my name to. I remember the ceiling of that holding cell better than I remember my own mother's face, which tells you something about the distribution of my attention over those 5 years. Then I woke up here, 26 years old again, mouth full of cotton, heart doing the exact BPM of a washing machine with a shoe in it, with a full backup of every mistake I was about to be handed the chance to not make. Most people, given a second run at the worst night of their life, would spend the first 4 seconds of clarity screaming. I spent mine doing math. The sedative Julian used, a veterinary compound Dex bought in bulk, because Dex bought everything in bulk, takes the legs out from under you but leaves the ceiling in focus. Vera had been given the whole glass and was still somewhere underneath it. I'd been given less or metabolized it meaner because I surfaced on the far side of the drug while she was still going under, slow, clumsy, thick-tongued but awake, which was the only edge the night asked for. What that bought me was a head start measured in minutes, not the hours Julian was counting on. So I used them, one small available thing at a time, because I have always been a man who does the small possible thing instead of the large impossible one. So the door, the deadbolt turned with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Then the cameras, every suite in the Aldwyn has them, a detail the hotel does not advertise and the Cole family, who owns 40% of the Aldwyn, absolutely knows about. I flipped them live and let them record a very boring tableau of 2 clothed adults who had touched nothing but the minibar. Then the wine. I poured the last inch of it into a water glass, capped it with the saucer from the coffee service, and set it behind the curtain like a man hiding a birthday present. The bottle I left out, generously photogenic, exactly where Julian would expect a guilty man to have abandoned it. Then I woke her up. Vera came back to consciousness the way a security system reboots after a power cut, not gently, hauling itself up through whatever Julian had put in the wine and snapping straight to a cold gray stare that did a full inventory of the room and found me at the top of the list of things that shouldn't be there. Her hair, normally pinned with the precision of a legal argument, had lost the argument entirely. She opened her mouth and I got there first, because I had rehearsed this in a cell for 5 years. "Before you decide which of us to kill," I said, "look at your reflection." She looked. I watched her clock it, the hair, the smudged everything, the story a hallway full of cameras would tell about a Sinclair heiress at 3 in the morning, and I watched the temperature in her eyes drop another 10 degrees. "There are 3 cameras in that hallway," I said, "and 1 photographer who works for my stepbrother, and in about 4 minutes someone is going to open that door hoping to sell what you look like right now. You are not walking out of here looking like a headline." And then I did the single most dangerous thing I had done in either life. I reached over, gathered the ruin of her hair in both hands and started fixing it. Practical. Logistical. A man defusing a bomb, not touching a woman. I told myself that twice. She let me. That was the part that surprised us both. She held perfectly still, watching me in the mirror with an expression I couldn't price, while my hands did something careful and my brain filed the moment under evidence I would never mention again. "You're going to explain," she said, not a question. "I'm going to do better than explain," I said. "I'm going to make you a headline nobody can sell." The doorknob turned, then met the bolt, and rattled, the specific offended rattle of a plan encountering resistance for the first time. Julian's voice came through the wood, warm and rehearsed and already narrating the tragedy. "Zane, open up. Whatever happened, we can manage it, we can," and I opened the door mid-sentence, so his face was still arranged for a funeral when it walked into a wedding. Behind him, Dex with his camera, the family's PR woman with her tablet, and 12 feet back my father's assistant, summoned to witness the ruin. A full audience. Julian had brought a full audience. "You're just in time," I said, and put my arm around Vera like it belonged there. Congratulate us. We were going to wait for the gala, but I let the pause do the work. It seems the whole family already knows. Julian's smile held. His eyes did not. Because 30 seconds earlier, from a phone he didn't know I'd already used, a message had gone out to both houses and one very friendly editor, Zane and Vera, engaged, making it official. You cannot leak a scandal about a couple who just announced the wedding. He'd built a gallows and I'd hung a banner on it. Beside me, Vera said nothing, which I was learning was the loudest thing she did. But her hand, cold, deliberate, closed over my wrist, and I felt her decide in real time that whatever I was more useful alive than exposed. What she was thinking, I found out later, was simpler and worse. No one has ever done anything for me without a bill attached. So what exactly does this one want? By 9 the next morning, both houses had gathered in the Cole Group boardroom to decide my future, which was thoughtful of them since I'd already decided it at 3. I want to describe the room because the room was the whole battle. On one side of a table, the length of a small runway, sat the Coles, my father, Roland, cleaning his glasses for the 3rd time in a way that meant he'd been fed a story he half believed. Cora beside him, my stepmother, immaculate in pearls and grief she'd clearly steamed that morning. And Julian, hair perfect, smile perfect, sitting the way a man sits when he's already rehearsed the eulogy and just needs the body to cooperate. On the other side, the Sinclairs, Cyrus at the head, 70-some years old and still the most dangerous circulation figure in the city because he owned the papers that decided whose scandals lived. Vera to his right. Nadia, her chief of staff, behind her, guarding a tablet like it was a sidearm and looking at me like I was a charge she was itching to press. Before the meeting, I'd retrieved the wine glass from behind the curtain and walked it out in a laundry bag at 6 in the morning, because the most secure courier in the world is a man who looks too tired to be doing anything interesting. It was already sitting in a private lab across town with a rush order and a fake name, ticking toward a date I'd chosen. Nobody in this room knew that. They thought they were here to manage a crisis. I was here to sign for a delivery. Cora opened because Cora always opened. We're all just so relieved, she said, voice warm as a radiator that's been off for a week, that whatever happened last night, it happened between two people who apparently care for each other. The pause before apparently could have parked a car in it. Though of course the timing does raise questions. It does, I agreed pleasantly, which took the air out of the room because agreeing is the one move nobody prepares a counter to. So let's answer them before the papers do. Vera and I have been discreet. Discretion looks a great deal like a scandal if you catch the last 5 minutes and none of the last 5 months. I did not look at Vera when I said 5 months, because we had known each other, romantically, for approximately 11 hours, and I did not want to watch her do the math on my nerve in front of witnesses. Cyrus spoke for the first time. He did not raise his voice. Men who own the megaphone never do. My granddaughter, he said, is not a public relations problem to be solved. She is the solution other people keep needing. His eyes moved to me with the specific weight of a man deciding whether to run a story. You're the coal they were going to trade for peace. Tell me, Zane, what do you actually want? Everyone at this table wants something. The honest ones say so. Here was the test. Last life, I never got this meeting. I was already a headline by 9. So I answered him the way you answer a man who can smell a lie through newsprint, with a true thing shaped like an offer. I want the merger to close on terms that don't let anyone in my family skim it, I said. And I'd prefer your granddaughter alive, unruined, and unmarried to my stepbrother. We can negotiate the order. Something happened in Cyrus's face that was not quite a smile but was in the same tax bracket. Interesting, he said, and let me live. The door opened then for coffee, and with it came Lena Roswell shipping, a laugh she kept warmed up for whoever was most useful in earshot, and a long history of being seated near me by people who wished I'd marry the balance sheet. She arrived in a cloud of what a shock, what a whirlwind, touched my arm as if checking it was still available, and said, Zane, you sly thing, and here I thought you were saving yourself. With a glance at Vera that was meant to measure her and instead just announced the ruler. I watched Vera not react, which is a skill, and I watched the not reacting cost her something, which was new. The coffee came on a tray and I intercepted it. This is the part I'd thought about most because it was the smallest and therefore the most dangerous. I made Vera's cup the way she takes it, which I knew because in a life she hadn't lived yet I'd spent 100 cold mornings watching her do it. A scandalous amount of milk, no sugar, and a half-second stir she always cut short because she found the ritual embarrassing. I set it in front of her, stir already cut short, and moved on to the next cup like it was nothing. She went very still. Not offended still, recalculating still. Because a man you met 11 hours ago should not know the exact geometry of your coffee, and there are only 2 explanations for it, obsession or impossibility. And Vera was too precise to accept either, which meant I had just handed her a problem she couldn't file, and Vera could not leave a problem unfiled any more than I could leave a wine glass unlabeled. How? She said, very quietly under the meeting, do you know that? Lucky guess, I said, which was the least lucky sentence I have ever spoken. Meanwhile, Julian was working. I could see it, the small tilt toward the PR woman, the murmur. Last life I'd learned his rhythm by heart. By noon he'd have a whisper out to a gossip desk framing the engagement as a panicked cover-up. Air caught, family scrambles, wedding announced to bury it. Right on schedule his phone did the small satisfied buzz of a man who just paid for a headline. Except the headline that landed 30 seconds later on every phone in the room at once was mine, seated at 3 in the morning to the one editor Cyrus didn't own and I did. Cole and Sinclair heirs confirm long private engagement, merger to proceed. Sources close to both families cite a relationship kept quiet to protect negotiations. Warm, boring, unkillable. You cannot sell scandal on top of awe. I watched Julian read it. I watched him read it again. I watched him look up at me with the first genuine expression he'd worn all morning, not anger, not yet, but the cold, dawning confusion of a man who has run this exact play before and never, not once, seen it fail. He didn't know about the 5 years. He just knew suddenly that his brother had started answering questions before Julian finished asking them. Something wrong? I asked. No, Julian said and smiled his elevator smile, and under the table I watched his thumb worry the edge of his phone like it had betrayed him. Across the room, Gideon Marsh, our CFO, forgettable on purpose, wearing shoes that cost a third of what he claimed to earn, leaned in to whisper something to Cora, and I filed the shoes exactly where I'd filed the coffee, under things that will matter later. The engagement party was held in the Sinclair atrium under 400 pounds of imported orchids, which is roughly the amount of beauty required to distract 2 families from the fact that they'd been trying to bankrupt each other since before I could walk. The orchids didn't quite manage it. Nothing distracts old money from a grudge. It just makes the grudge better dressed. Vera and I arrived as a unit, which we had practiced exactly 0 times and performed like we'd been rehearsing for years, because it turns out that 2 people who are each individually terrified of being red will when standing next to each other become a wall. She'd been briefed by Nadia on our story. I'd been briefed by nobody, because I'd already lived the next 5 years and knew how everyone in this room took their disappointment. We moved through the crowd finishing each other's half-lies. She'd start a sentence about how we'd met. I'd land it before she committed to a date, and she'd let me, and somewhere around the 3rd handoff I felt her stop bracing for me to fumble it. You're unnervingly good at this, she murmured, smiling at a shipping magnate over my shoulder. I've had practice lying to these exact people, I said, which was true in a way she couldn't audit. The performance had one job tonight and it wasn't romance. It was armor, because a public, radiant, obviously fine couple is a much harder target than a scandal, and I needed us armored before Julian took his shot, which per the schedule burned into my memory would come during the toasts, when the room was warm and the stakeholders were watching and humiliation would travel fastest. First, though, Lena. She found me near the champagne because Lena found everyone near the champagne and she'd upgraded her approach from proprietary to public. Zane, she said, loud enough to carry, resting her hand on my lapel like she was appraising fabric, you have to settle a bet for me. Half the room thinks this engagement is real and half thinks it's the cleverest merger clause anyone's ever written. A laugh warm for the audience. I told them I know you don't do sentiment. It was a small, precise knife, aimed to make Vera either fight for me undignified or let it stand humiliating. Lena had built a lose-lose and handed me the pen, so I took the 3rd door. I lifted Lena's hand off my lapel gently the way you remove a leaf, and I reached back without looking and found Vera's hand, and I laced my fingers through hers in full view of the half-room taking the bet. Tell them you were wrong, I said to Lena, pleasant as ever. It's more interesting than most things you tell people. It was supposed to be optics, pure stagecraft, a handhold for the cameras and the gossips and the bet. Except Vera's hand was cold. She ran cold. I'd learn always. A furnace that spent everything it made on her brain and left nothing for her fingers, and mine wasn't. And she didn't pull away and I didn't let go, and the moment ran about a half-second longer than optics strictly required. A half-second is nothing. A half-second is also the exact length of time it takes 2 very controlled people to notice they've stopped performing. I felt her thumb shift once over my knuckle like she was checking the temperature of a thing she'd already decided not to want. Neither of us mentioned it. That was becoming our entire language, the enormous things we agreed not to mention. Lena retreated to redistribute her charm. Vera looked at our joined hands, then at me, and said nothing, which by now I could translate, filed under unsolved. Then the toasts. Julian rose with a champagne flute and the elevator smile, and I set my glass down because I knew what came next the way you know the last stare in the dark. He toasted us warmly, generously, a brother's love, and then mid-warmth he pivoted. And it's such a relief, he said to the stakeholders more than to us, to see Zane in a stable place. We all remember the Halloran Port contract. A pause engineered. 40 million gone on his watch. I only mention it because, hand to heart, family forgives. Investors have longer memories. The room did the thing rooms do, it inhaled. Last life this exact sentence in a slightly different room had ended me because last life I'd stammered and defended, and a defense sounds identical to a confession when your voice shakes. The Halloran contract was real. The 40 million loss was real. What Julian was counting on was that nobody in the room knew the loss had been caused by a supplier fraud that I'd flagged in writing 4 days before the collapse. A memo my father never saw because it died in Cora's office, and which I had in this life spent a boring Tuesday retrieving from the one server nobody thought to wipe. You're right, Julian, investors do have long memories, I said unhurried, pulling my phone. So let's give them the whole thing to remember. I read the room, the memo's date, the supplier's name, the exact warning I'd filed, and then the internal timestamp showing it had been opened once in an office that was not mine and not my father's. I didn't say Cora's name. I didn't have to. I just let the timestamp sit there glowing while 40 men who move markets recalculated which coal was the risk. I must have misremembered, Julian said, smile holding knuckles white on the flute. It happens, I said. Investors forgive. The room laughed with me at him, the worst arithmetic of his life, and Julian took his first real wound of the night, the kind that doesn't bleed but shows up in every meeting for a year. A reputational ding among the only people whose opinion he'd ever wanted. He sat down slower than he stood up. I should have enjoyed it more. I would have, except across the atrium, half hidden by 400 pounds of orchids, Cora was not watching Julian. She was watching me steadily, without the grief, without the pearls and sympathy performance, with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself in a holding cell, the flat, patient calm of someone who has just decided to stop underestimating a problem and start solving it permanently. She lifted her champagne a half-inch toward me. A toast. A promise. I knew that look. I knew what it meant because in a life she didn't remember she'd already done what she was about to do again, build the embezzlement frame, the clean one, the one that had put my name on a warehouse and my body in a cell. She thought she was starting a war I wouldn't see coming. She was starting the exact war I'd come back to win, and the frame she was about to build was the one thread that, pulled correctly, unravels every hand that ever touched it. I lifted my glass back. Please, I thought, begin. The merger needed a lead from the coal side, one name on the paperwork, one throat for the lawyers to point at, and Cora had spent the week making sure that name wasn't mine. She did it the way she did everything, which is to say she never once said it. She simply arranged the world so the conclusion built itself. A quiet lunch with the 2 board members who'd retire soonest and worried most. A memo about optics that mentioned my recent personal turbulence without mentioning that the turbulence was her son drugging a woman. And Gideon Marsh, our CFO, producing a projection so grim that only a steady, uncontroversial hand, Julian's, obviously, could be trusted to steer the deal. It was competent work. In my last life, it had worked. I'd sat in this exact boardroom 5 years ago and watched them vote me out of my own future while I said reasonable things nobody was listening to. This time I came early, and I came to the parking garage. Dex was there at 7 in the morning loading camera cases into a van, because a man like Dex is always either arriving from a job or leaving for one, and never anywhere a subpoena can find him twice. I'd known Dex in the other life too, briefly, near the end, when he'd sold me the one piece of truth that arrived 5 years too late to save me. He'd seen me at the hotel, of course, standing in that doorway ruining Julian's morning. What he didn't know yet was that we were about to be business partners. I figured I'd cut out the middle half-decade. You don't know it yet, I told him, which made him reach for the pepper spray fair. But you will. Here's the part that matters. My stepbrother pays you in cash and lies, and both of those run out. I pay in a number and a door out of the country if it ever comes to that. I named the number. It was larger than Julian's and more importantly real. All I want is a copy of what you already have, the hotel hallway, the sedative you sourced, the instructions he texted you. You keep the originals. You keep working for him, smiling exactly as you are. You just also work for me. Dex is not a good man, but he is an honest instrument, and honest instruments respond to being read correctly. And if I say no, he said, then you're the only person holding evidence in a crime, and you're holding it for the man who'd be delighted to let you hold it alone, I said. I'm the exit, Dex. Everyone in this story needs an exit eventually. I'm just the only one offering yours at a discount. He took the number. Of course he took the number. By 7:20 I had the hallway footage, the sedative invoice with Julian's initials on the delivery, and a text thread that read like a confession with the grammar of a man who thought he'd never be read. I didn't use any of it. Using it now would spend it. Instead, I filed it beside the wine at the lab and the memo from the server, and I built the thing all of it was for, a ledger of my own. Because here is what I understood that Cora didn't know I understood. She and Gideon had been skimming Coal Group for years through a lattice of shell vendors, and to hide it they kept 2 sets of numbers, the real one and the pretty one. Their whole plan against me depended on eventually pointing at the pretty numbers and saying, look what Zane did. So I built a 3rd set. Not fake. The opposite of fake. A clean, sourced reconstruction of the real money, every shell vendor named, every wire dated, sitting quietly in a folder waiting for the exact moment someone accused me of the thing they'd done. I let them build the gallows. I even brought lumber. It's remarkable how much rope people will pay out when they think you don't know it's a noose. The board meeting itself was theater, and I let it be. I made no fuss as Gideon walked the room through his grim projection. I asked 2 mild questions that made him slightly too comfortable. I watched Julian preen into the leadership role like a man trying on a coat in a mirror. Fine, wear it. Coats come off. The buffer came in the second hour, and it came for Vera. A Sinclair side faction, old Sinclair money that had never wanted the merger and liked me even less, had cornered her by the windows during a recess, 3 of them doing the thing powerful men do to a woman they've decided to treat as a negotiable term. Questions dressed as concern. Was she sure about this? Was the engagement sound? Was she perhaps being used? I watched her hold the line alone, spine perfect, cold hands folded, and I watched a muscle move once at her jaw, a tell I knew, the one she showed only when she was doing the math on how much a room was going to cost her. I didn't rescue her. Rescuing Vera would have been the single most insulting thing I could do, and also she didn't need it. I did something smaller. I crossed the room, put myself at her shoulder, a half step ahead, angled so the 3 of them had to include me or look like they were excluding me, and I answered the question they hadn't quite dared ask. You're wondering if the merger's sound without her running point on the Sinclair side, I said. It isn't. That's the whole answer. She's not the price of the deal, gentlemen. She's the reason it's worth doing. I said it flat like a fact off a spreadsheet because sentiment would have embarrassed her and a fact could not. Then, because the room was still watching and I needed a reason, I set my hand at the small of her back lightly, the universal grammar of we are leaving now, and steered us away. Stagecraft, pure optics. Except she leaned barely into the steering instead of away from it and let me set the pace, and under her breath once we'd cleared them she said, I had it. I know, I said. I wasn't helping you, I was billing them. She almost smiled. I clocked the almost and pretended I hadn't, and we walked back into the theater as a wall. We had until the vote. And right on schedule, the schedule I'd been reading like a train timetable, Gideon rose to raise something uncomfortable and slid a folder down the table, and in it were the falsified documents, the pretty numbers dressed as my crime, the exact frame that in another life had ended me. I looked at the folder. I did not open it. I already knew every page because I'd spent 5 years being buried under them. Take your time, I told the room, and thought about the third ledger sitting in the dark and the name that was actually on the lumber. They called the accusation a conversation, which is what people call an ambush when they've catered it. By the time I arrived, deliberately 4 minutes late, because a man who's early looks worried and a man who's on time looks rehearsed, the folder had already done its rounds. You could see it in the faces around the table. The board had read the pretty numbers. The ones that said Zane Cole had routed 40-odd million through vendors that didn't quite exist, and they'd arranged their expressions into the particular blend of sorrow and appetite that people wear when someone they don't like turns out to deserve it. Cora sat at my father's side, wearing her best wounded dignity. Julian sat trying not to look like a man watching a horse he'd bet on cross the line. Gideon stood because the executioner always stands. Zane, my father said, and cleaned his glasses, and I hated briefly how much I still wanted him to be right about me. Tell me this is a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, I said, and let the room have its little intake of breath. It's a very carefully understood thing, just not by the people who wrote it. I set my own folder on the table. I didn't slide it dramatically. Drama is what you do when you're not sure the contents will land. Before anyone votes on my funeral, I'd like to enter 3 items into the record. It'll take 4 minutes. Gideon can time it, he's good with numbers he didn't make up. I opened with the ledger. Not the pretty one, the true one, the third set, the clean reconstruction I'd built while they were building the frame. Where their document showed money leaving through phantom vendors on my authorization, mine showed the same wires arriving somewhere because money is rude that way. It always goes somewhere, and the somewhere was a lattice of shells that terminated after enough layers to bore a jury in 2 accounts. I put the account holders on the screen. One was a company Gideon controlled. The other paid Cora's private household staff. The room's temperature did something I'd waited 5 years to feel it do. That's fabricated, Gideon said too fast. It's sourced, I said. Every wire has a counterparty, and counterparties keep their own records, and I asked them nicely. I let that sit. Here's the tell though, your version has me authorizing transfers on the 11th. I was in Rotterdam on the 11th at your instruction signing for the port contract, the one Julian likes to bring up. There are customs stamps, there is a hotel. There is, I'm told, unflattering security footage of me at a breakfast buffet. A man cannot embezzle from 2 countries at once. I've tried to be many things, bilocational isn't one. Then the second item, because a reversal is only a reversal if it keeps turning, the lab result. The wine from the Aldwin, drugged, dated, chain of custody clean, matched to a veterinary sedative purchased in bulk on an invoice that item 3 bore Julian's initials at delivery. I didn't narrate it cruelly. I didn't have to. I just laid the 3 papers side by side, the money that ran to Cora, the drug that ran to Julian, the alibi that ran through Rotterdam, and let 40 people who move markets do the arithmetic that markets are for. I'm not accusing anyone, I said, which was the cruelest sentence available because it made them accuse themselves in the privacy of their own faces. I'm just declining to be accused. Gideon broke the way over-leveraged things break all at once and toward the nearest exit. I want a lawyer, he said to the room, which is the sound a man makes when he's just realized which side of the ledger he's on. He'd flipped by morning. Men who launder for other people always do. Loyalty is a luxury and he'd spent his on shoes. And through all of it, this is the part I keep. Vera did the smallest, loudest thing. She'd been served coffee she hadn't touched, and a plate of the little pastries the cold board always laid out and nobody ever ate. Halfway through my 4 minutes without looking at me, she picked up the coffee, made the way she takes it, because I'd gotten to the tray first again and drank it. Then she ate one of the pastries. In a room deciding whether I was a criminal, the Sinclair heiress calmly ate breakfast at my table, which told 40 market movers exactly where the smartest person in the room had placed her bet. She didn't defend me. Defending me would have been noise. She just declined to flinch publicly at my side, and for Vera, who had never once in her life let a room see her choose not pulling away, was the closest thing to a vow she had. "You're enjoying this," she murmured later in the hall. "I'm enjoying the pastry logistics," I said. "You backed me in front of your grandfather's whole network." "I backed the ledger," she said. "It was very well built." A pause. "The pastry was stale." "I know," I said. "You ate it anyway." She didn't answer that, which was the answer. I should have walked out of that room having won. On paper I had. Gideon was gone, Julian was gray, the frame was dust, and every receipt I'd carried through 5 years and one death had done its job in 4 minutes. This was the top of the mountain I'd been climbing since I woke up in that bed. I let myself have exactly one clean breath of it. Then Cora stood. She didn't argue the ledger. That's when I knew something had gone wrong. She didn't argue, didn't weep, didn't reach for a single one of the moves I'd memorized. In the life I remembered, this was the moment she folded and spent 2 years quietly plotting my warehouse. Instead, she looked at me with something I had never once seen on her face in either life, not fury, not fear, but recalculation, the specific stillness of a person revising a model. And she said evenly, "You've clearly prepared for the woman I was going to be." Then she picked up her phone, made one call I couldn't hear, said 4 words, and hung up. And for the first time since I'd opened my eyes with 5 years of answers in my head, I looked at the next page of the future and found it blank. I didn't know who she'd called. I didn't know what came next. The map I'd died to bring back had just run out of road. For 5 years, the future had been a book I'd already read. Now it was a hallway with the lights off, and I discovered something unflattering about myself. I am much braver when I have the answer key. The 4 words Cora spoke into her phone turned out to be, roughly, use the Sinclair one. I pieced it together over the next 2 days the way you piece together a language you don't speak from the shape of the reactions. A term sheet leaked that only 6 people had seen. A confidential Sinclair valuation surfaced in Julian's hands during a call he shouldn't have won. Someone inside Vera's own house was feeding my stepbrother the merger's soft underbelly, and the whole thing had the fingerprints of a plan that in my last life never happened, because in my last life I was already ruined by now, and Cora had never needed a second weapon. I'd changed the past enough that it had stopped telling me the future. I'd made her improvise, and an improvising Cora was a Cora I'd never met. Which is a long way of admitting that for the first time I needed help, and the only person in either family sharp enough to give it was the woman I'd spent a decade being told to destroy. I brought the problem to Vera the way you bring a live wire to the one person who won't drop it. I laid out what I knew, the leaks, the pattern, the impossible timing, and I did not, for once, arrive with the solution pre-packaged. I watched her notice that. She noticed everything. It was exhausting and increasingly the best part of my day. "You don't have the ending," she said, not a question. She'd clocked it that I'd spent weeks being 3 moves ahead of everyone, and now I was 2 moves behind something. "I have a gap," I admitted. "You have a mole," she said, already pulling a slim laptop toward her, already turning that ledgermind on her own house, cold and fast and beautiful in the specific way of a person doing the thing they were built for. 6 people saw that term sheet. I trust 2 of them with my life and 1 of them with my lunch. That leaves 3. Her ring turned once on her finger. "Give me a day. Here is where I made my mistake, and it was not a strategic one. I was so deep in the mole, running names, cross-checking the leak timing against phone records decks helped me pull, sleeping 4 hours a night in a war room that smelled like cold coffee and worse decisions, that I forgot the small thing. For weeks I had made Vera's coffee. Every morning her way, the scandalous milk and the cut-short stir, set at her elbow before she asked, a gesture I'd told myself was strategy and had long since stopped being. On the 3rd morning of the mole hunt I didn't. I was heads down on a burner phone timeline and the tray came and went and I didn't move. I didn't notice. She did. I looked up an hour later and found her not working. Just sitting very still with the particular stillness I'd learned to read, the jaw, the ring, except aimed at nothing, at the empty spot on the table where a cup should have been. She caught me looking. Her face closed like a shop at 5 in the afternoon sharp. "You forgot the coffee," she said, and the second it was out of her mouth I watched her hate that she'd said it, hate that she'd noticed, hate that the noticing had a temperature. Vera Sinclair had just discovered out loud that she'd come to expect something from a Cole, and she looked as betrayed by herself as she'd ever looked by anyone. "I'll make it," I said, standing. "Don't," she said too fast, and then, recovering cold again, armor back on, "We have a mole, sit down." But she didn't take her eyes off me for a second longer than she should have, and I understood, with the useless clarity of a man who's out of foreknowledge but not out of eyes, that the absence had told her something the gesture never could. "You don't miss a thing you were only tolerating." I sat down. I made the coffee anyway 10 minutes later and set it at her elbow, and she drank it without a word and without meeting my eyes, and neither of us mentioned it per the treaty. We closed on the mole by nightfall, or I thought we did. I had it narrowed to one of the three, a junior Sinclair VP named Reyes with new debts and an old grudge, and I was assembling the case to walk into Cyrus's office and hand him the traitor, feeling almost like myself again, almost ahead. Then Vera set down her cup and said, "It's not Reyes. The debts are real and were meant to be found. Someone wanted us to chase the obvious one." She turned the laptop toward me, and on it was a trap, a fake term sheet revision she'd seeded to exactly 3 inboxes 4 days ago, before I'd even brought her the problem, each version salted with a different fabricated number. "The leak that reached Julian this morning had the number I sent to one specific person," she said. "I've known how to catch the mole since Tuesday. I was waiting to see which of us would say a name first and whether you'd chase the bait like everyone else." I stared at her. She'd been running her own operation underneath mine the entire time. She'd tested me. She'd outplanned the man who used to own the future. I have been afraid of a lot of things in 2 lifetimes. I had never once until that moment been delighted by being beaten. "Who is it?" I said. She told me the name. It was worse than a mole. And she smiled, a real one, finally finished, at the look on my face. "You're enjoying this," I said. "I'm enjoying the logistics," she said, handing me back my own line, and I realized the treaty had a new clause neither of us had signed, and that I was, against 5 years of planning and 1 death's worth of caution, in very serious trouble. The mole was Harlan. Harlan Voss had sat at Cyrus Sinclair's right hand for 30 years, had held Vera on his knee at some function she claimed not to remember, and had 3 weeks ago started feeding my stepbrother the merger's every soft spot in exchange for the quiet erasure of a debt Julian had helpfully arranged for him to owe. That's the part I keep circling. Julian didn't find Harlan corrupt. Julian built the corruption, loaned him the rope, then sold him the ladder out. It was, I'll admit, the first genuinely clever thing my stepbrother had done, which meant Cora had done it and let him hold the pen. Exposing Harlan required a joint operation, and running a joint operation with Vera was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in 2 lifetimes. We built it over one long night at her kitchen counter. Not a war room this time, just a counter, 2 laptops, and a bottle of wine neither of us drank because we'd both developed feelings about wine. She handled the Sinclair mechanics, I handled the trap. We fed Harlan a final piece of bait so specific that when it reappeared in Julian's hands on a recorded line, because I'd learned my lesson about receipts before I was born again, it could only have come from one desk. We sprang it in front of the merger committee, both houses present. I let Vera land it. It was her house to clean. She walked Harlan through his own timeline with the gentleness of a surgeon and the mercy of a tax audit. And when she played the recording, Julian's voice, unmistakable, thanking a man by name for a number no outsider should have, she wasn't looking at Harlan. She was looking at Julian, and so was every person in that room whose money and opinion he had spent his whole life trying to earn. Julian did the thing that finishes people like Julian, he explained. He talked. A guilty man's mouth is the most loyal witness the prosecution has, and his ran for a full minute before he understood the room had already left him. Cyrus said nothing. Cyrus didn't have to. He simply looked at Julian the way you look at a stain you've decided to replace the carpet over, and I watched my stepbrother become, in real time, a man these people would no longer return calls from. The reputational wound from the toast had been a bruise. This was the bone. Afterward, Cyrus found me in the corridor. He'd been testing me for weeks. I'd felt each one small cold questions with trap doors under them, and I braced for another. Instead, he said, "Harlan was my friend for 30 years. You caught what I missed." He let that cost him something visibly, which from Cyrus was practically a confession. "My granddaughter chose you before I did. I've spent a career being right before other people. It's disorienting to be second." A pause. "Don't make me regret being second, Zane." Then he walked off, and I understood I'd been handed the most dangerous ally in the city on loan against my behavior. The father thread I opened quietly the same week because extraction is not a public art. I didn't accuse Cora to Roland. Accusations bounce off a man who's been managed for 20 years. He's been inoculated. Instead, I brought him the Halloran memo, the one that died in Cora's office, the one I'd read to a ballroom, and I let him hold the paper that proved I'd tried to save the company and someone had made sure he never saw it. I didn't say her name. I let the timestamp say it. My father cleaned his glasses 4 times, which for Roland is the equivalent of weeping openly, and said, "I didn't see this." "I know," I said. "That was the point." I left him with it. You don't pull a man out of a current by yanking. You just show him which way the water's actually moving and let him get tired of drowning. And Vera. We were leaving a late meeting, both wrung out, and my tie had gone crooked hours earlier in the specific way that ties betray you when you've stopped performing. She stopped me in the empty corridor, no cameras, no committee, no audience, none of the reasons that had justified every touch until now, and she reached up and fixed it. Straightened the knot, smoothed it flat, 2 seconds of her cold hands at my collar, entirely unbilled. I had at that point a narration for everything. 5 years of practice turning every feeling into a sentence before it could turn into a problem. And I stood there in that corridor with the smartest woman I'd ever known adjusting my tie for no reason a spreadsheet would accept, and I had nothing. The commentary just stopped. The private muttering voice that had got me through a holding cell and a resurrection went quiet for the first time in 2 lifetimes, and all that was left was the fact of her hands and the appalling, undeniable evidence that I was happy. There, she said, you were listening to port. Vera, I said, and didn't know the rest of the sentence, which had never once happened to me. Don't, she said softly, not cold this time, just careful, the way you're careful with something you've decided you want and haven't forgiven yourself for yet. We have an arrangement. Arrangements are clean. She stepped back. Say good night, Zane. Good night, Zane, I said, because I am a coward with good comic timing, and she almost laughed, and it was the best sound in either life. I should have gone home light. Julian was finished, Cyrus was mine, my father was surfacing, and the woman I'd stopped pretending about had just fixed my tie in a room with no witnesses. Instead, my phone buzzed. Cora. A single line and a photograph. The line read, "You've been so busy saving everyone. Shall we talk about the one person you couldn't save?" The photograph was my mother, young, alive, standing in front of a house I recognized, on a day I'd spent 5 years and 1 death trying to forget. She thought she'd found the wound I couldn't dress. She thought the mother was the one card I'd never see coming. She didn't know I'd come back knowing exactly what she did to my mother, and that I'd been saving that receipt for last. Cora wanted to talk about my mother, so I let her in a conference room with the door closed and a folder she didn't know I'd brought. She'd built her whole approach around the assumption that grief makes you stupid. It's a reasonable assumption. Usually it's true. She sat across from me and unspooled her version with the practiced tenderness of a woman diffusing a man she thinks is about to break. My mother, unstable, a drinker, a liability the family had managed out of kindness before quietly setting her aside. Roland's first marriage, she implied, had simply been a mistake corrected. She watched my face for the crack. I'd like to say I stayed calm because I'm strong. The truth is I stayed calm because I'd already had this grief. I'd spent 5 years and a death sitting with it, turning it over, and somewhere in year 3 I'd stopped feeling it and started reading it, and reading is a colder activity than feeling. You're close, I said and opened the folder. You've got the shape right. My mother was managed out. She just wasn't unstable when it started. She became unstable, which is a different verb and it has a subject. I laid it out the way I'd laid out the ledger because the method was the message. The leaked private medical record that ended her on a board she chaired. The whisper campaign with your specific fingerprints, Cora, the same grammar you used on me 20 years later. The transfer of her charitable foundation into a trust you happened to administer 3 months before Roland even knew she was sick. You didn't correct a mistake, I said. You engineered a vacancy. My mother was the first person you erased to make room. I was just the second. I didn't raise my voice. That was the whole point. I'd learned from watching her. The woman who never shouts owns the room. The door opened then because I'd timed it to. My father was standing there. He'd heard most of it. I'd made sure he would, the way she'd once made sure he wouldn't. Roland Cole looked at his wife of 20 years and then at the folder, and then at a photograph of a foundation transfer dated 3 months before he knew his first wife was dying, and he cleaned his glasses exactly once very slowly and set them down. Cora, he said, just her name. But it came out in a register I'd never heard from him, not the managed man's, the man's, and I watched her realize that the reality she'd curated for 2 decades had a door in it after all, and that I'd just walked her husband through it. That was the extraction. It wasn't a shout or a slap. It was a father setting down his glasses and for the first time in 20 years seeing the room he was actually standing in. The financials closed the same day. Gideon, cooperating now with the enthusiasm of a man trading years off a sentence, handed over the architecture, the shell vendors, the dates, the household account that had eaten a fortune one quiet wire at a time. Everything I'd reconstructed from the outside, he confirmed from the in. Cora's siphoning wasn't an allegation anymore, it was arithmetic. And in the margins of it, a small ugly bonus, Lena Roswell's name on a message from the night of the hotel, 3 words long, "Is it done?" Sent to Julian at 2:47 in the morning. She'd known about the frame. She'd waited up for it. The socialite who'd needled Vera about sentiment had been awake at nearly 3 in the morning, checking whether I'd been successfully destroyed. I filed it. Lena would keep. That night Vera came to find me and we finally stopped performing. No cameras, no committee. Just the two of us on the cold balcony of a building that belonged to one of our families and would soon belong to both. And for once, neither of us reached for the treaty. She started it, which I should have expected because she started everything now. I looked you up, she said. The real you, the Halloran memo, the port dates, the way you knew my coffee. Her ring turned once. You move like a man who's already seen how everything ends. I stopped believing in coincidences about you around the third impossible thing. A pause. I'm not going to ask how. I don't think I'd like the answer, and I've decided I don't need it. She looked at me, gray eyes doing something they never did in public, holding still, warm, undefended. I need one thing that's true, just one. Everything between us has been staged. Give me one thing that isn't. So I gave her the truest thing I had, which was not the rebirth and not the revenge and not the 5 years. It was smaller and worse. The coffee stopped being strategy in the first week, I said. I keep making it because the 10 seconds it takes are the only 10 seconds of either of my lives when I'm not planning anything. You're the only thing I do that isn't a move. I heard it land. I heard myself say either of my lives and watched her decide again not to ask. That's the true thing. The engagement's the only lie I've got left, and I don't want it anymore. Vera Sinclair, who had never in her life let a room see her choose, looked at me on a cold balcony with no room watching and chose. She didn't say it. She just took my hand, hers cold, mine not, the old arithmetic, and held it unbilled, unstaged, and we stood there not mentioning the enormous thing, except this time the not mentioning meant the opposite of what it used to. My phone buzzed against the railing. I almost didn't look. I wish I hadn't. It was a live stream link, already climbing past 10,000 viewers, titled with Vera's name and a word I won't repeat, scheduled to go fully public at 9 the next morning. Julian's last card, the fake engagement, and a curated pile of lies about her, aimed to detonate the merger and her name in one shot. He'd stopped trying to beat me. He decided to hurt her instead, which meant he'd finally, mercifully, stopped thinking, and a man who stopped thinking is the easiest kind of man in the world to finish. The live stream was set to go public at 9. I had until then, which is not a lot of time, unless you've spent 5 years learning that time is the only thing revenge and love have in common. Both are just what you do with the hours nobody thinks you have. The instinct, the old instinct, the one I'd had in a hotel hallway a lifetime ago, was to bury it. Kill the link, lawyer the platform, threaten the host, make it disappear. And I could have. I had the receipts to make almost anything disappear now. But burying it was the losing move dressed as the winning one, because a thing you bury can be dug up, and Julian was exactly the kind of man to keep a shovel. So I didn't bury it. I let it run. I found Vera before dawn and told her what he'd built, the fake engagement exposed, the curated lies, the whole ugly package aimed at her name, and I watched her go still, and I braced for the cold to come back, the armor, the say goodnight Zane. It didn't. She listened to the end, and then she said the thing that made me certain, if I hadn't been already, what do you need from me to end him? Not protect me, not make it stop. End him. She'd stopped being someone this happened to. She was in the chair beside mine now, reading the same ledger. I need you to let them look, I said. All of them, tomorrow. I need you to walk into that signing and let the whole room believe he won. She understood instantly, because of course she did. Bait, she said. You want him to take the shot in front of witnesses. I want him to take the shot in front of witnesses I've chosen, I said, holding a microphone I've wired next to a screen I control. I paused. It means standing in a room while people who have known you your whole life watch a lie about you and decide for 1 minute whether to believe it. I won't pretend that costs nothing. It's the most expensive thing I've ever asked anyone to do. Vera turned her ring once and looked at me and did not reach for the armor. I've spent my whole life being handled, she said. You're the first person who ever asked me to fight instead of hiding me. Wire the microphone. And then, no cameras, no committee, no arrangement left to hide behind, she crossed the room and kissed me. Cold hands at my collar, the old arithmetic, except this time there was no excuse available for either of us and neither of us went looking for one. When she pulled back, she said, that wasn't strategy. In case you were about to narrate it, a strategy. I had been. She knew me now the way I'd known her coffee, from the inside, from a place that shouldn't have been possible, and I stopped pretending the engagement was the only real thing that had grown out of a lie. The arrangement's over, I said. Good, she said. It was the worst thing about you. The reckoning I staged as a signing, because the most dangerous place to put a guilty man is somewhere he thinks he's about to win. Invitations went out for the merger's formal execution. Both houses, the board, the lawyers, the press pool. Cyrus curated down to the 3 faces I wanted. Julian was told, through a channel I let him think was secure, that the deal was closing over my objections and that Cora was being brought back in to stabilize the family. He believed it. He believed it because it was the story he'd have written, and men who scheme are always most gullible about plots that flatter them. I spent the last night before it setting the receipts in their order, and I want to describe the order because the order was the mercy and the order was the blade. The wine and the sedative invoice, so the drugging would come first and frame everything after it as the act of a man who tried to poison the whole story at its root. Then the third ledger and Gideon's confirmation, live in person, the CFO himself walking the room through the money. Then Harlan's recording, so Cyrus's own people would hear Julian's voice by a traitor. Then the medical record and the foundation transfer, so my father standing, not managed, at the head of his own company for the first time in 20 years, could see in public what had been done to the woman before Cora. And last, held back Dex and his originals, and the sentence that would turn a family scandal into a matter for people with badges. Everyone in that room tomorrow believed they were coming to watch two houses sign a future. Vera found me at the table at 3 in the morning, surrounded by the paper, and didn't ask if I was ready. She sat down, took the cold coffee out of my hand, replaced it with a warm one she'd made her way, then mine. She'd learned mine and said, "You've assigned everyone a seat but yourself. Where do you sit?" "Next to you," I said, without planning it, which was becoming a habit. "Then it's already the best table you've ever built," she said. I looked at the receipts laid out in their order, the drugging and the money and the traitor and the mother and the man with the camera, 5 years and 1 death arranged into a single morning. Cora thought she was walking into a signing. Julian thought he was walking into a coronation. Lena thought she was walking into a wedding she could still ruin. They were all correct that history was about to be made. They were merely wrong about the genre. It wasn't a signing, it was a sentencing, and I'd already assigned the seats. They came dressed for a signing. That was the first thing I noticed, and the last thing that gave me any pause: the good suits, the practiced smiles, the champagne chilling on a cart nobody would get to drink. Cora in fresh pearls restored. Julian in a suit a half-step too bright, already arranging his face for a coronation. Lena near the back, seated where a person sits when they intend to ruin a wedding and want a good view of the bride. A room full of people who had spent a decade or a lifetime underestimating a quiet man, gathered in one place on time by invitation. I'd promised myself I wouldn't enjoy it. I broke that promise in the first 4 minutes. I let Julian start, because bait only works if the fish believes it swam there itself. He rose with a remote in his hand and the live stream queued up, and he began to tell the room about Vera, the fake engagement, the curated lies, the whole ugly package, playing to the press pool, not knowing Cyrus had curated it down to 3 faces I'd chosen. He got about 90 seconds into ruining her before I let the screen behind him change to mine. Then I read them the order. First the wine, the drugged glass from the Aldwin, the lab result, the sedative invoice with Julian's initials at delivery, and the suite's own footage showing exactly nothing had happened in that bed, except a frame being built around 2 unconscious people. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees, because the thing about a man crying liar is that it lands differently once everyone's seen he began the evening by drugging the woman he's slandering. Then the money. Gideon Marsh stood, cooperating, gray, trading years off a sentence, and walked the room through the shell vendors and the wires himself, Liv, the CFO who'd built the maze, narrating his own dead ends until every path terminated in 2 accounts, his and the one that paid Cora's household staff. Not an allegations. Arithmetic read aloud in his own voice. Then Harlan's recording so Cyrus's own people could hear Julian's voice by a traitor by name. I watched the last of Julian standing leave the room like air from a slit tire. Then the mother. I put the leaked medical record and the foundation transfer on the screen, dated 3 months before my father knew his first wife was dying, and I did not narrate it because some receipts are cruelest read silently. My father read it standing, Roland Cole, upright at the head of his own company for the first time in 20 years, no one managing the angle of the light for him anymore. He didn't shout. He'd learned that from watching me, and I'd learned it from watching the woman who tried to erase us both. He simply turned to the board and said, "In the man's register, not the managed man's. Effective now, Cora is removed from every position, trust, and account bearing this family's name. My son flagged the Halloran fraud 4 days before it cost us $40 million. I never saw the memo. I've since learned why. He cleaned his glasses once and put them back on. I'd like to correct the record on which of my sons I trust with this company. That was the restoration. He gave it to me himself, unprompted, in front of the people whose respect he'd let them steal from me, which is the only way that particular gift means anything. I'd spent 5 years and a death wanting to force this moment. He handed it to me freely, and free was better than forced by a distance I couldn't have measured. Then the badges. Dex and his originals and the specific documents that turned a family scandal into a matter for people whose cars have lights on top. The drugging, with a witness now willing to say so under oath. The forged financial instruments. The traitor he'd bought on tape, every tool he'd built to put my name on a crime, turned to face the only direction that mattered. In the life I remembered, ending me had taken Julian 5 years, a warehouse, and a match. This time he'd handed me enough to finish him in a single morning, and no warehouse ever had to burn. Julian went out with a hand on his elbow, and I made myself watch, because I owed the version of me who died in a cell the courtesy of seeing it end differently. The downfalls were proportional, which was the whole point. Julian lost the only thing he'd ever wanted to be seen as the worthy heir, and lost it publicly, watching the seat go to the brother he'd tried to erase. Cora lost the man, then the name, then the money in that order because she'd valued them in that order, and I am nothing if not precise. Gideon kept his freedom and lost the career. His cooperation was his only mercy, and he'd spent it well. Lena, I almost let her walk. Then I let one message onto the screen, timestamp 2:47 in the morning, 3 words long, is it done? And watched a room of people who'd fed on her charm for years quietly decide to stop returning her calls. She'd wanted status. I let the status leave on its own. And Dex, who'd sold everyone out for market rate and thereby been the most honest person in the whole affair, walked out into the morning with his exit and his number, which is exactly what I'd promised him. Because a man is only worth the deals he keeps with people who can't make him. We married 3 months later. For real, in a room with no cameras, a novelty for both of us. Cyrus gave her away, and in doing so gave me the closest thing to a blessing a man who owns the papers ever gives. He said nothing and printed nothing, which for Cyrus is a love letter. My father stood where a father stands. My mother's watch was on my wrist. The vows were private. I'll give you the shape of mine, not the whole. The first time we met, I told her, I woke up next to you and did the sensible thing. I ran. It cost me everything, and I'd do it again 100 times just to arrive here on the 101st. This time I didn't run. I reached up cold room, her hair pinned with that surgical exactness I'd once undone in a hotel with an excuse about cameras, and I tucked one strand back into place, no excuse offered, none needed. I spent 5 years and one whole death knowing how everything ends. You're the only thing I never saw coming. Her hands were cold in mine. Mine weren't. The old arithmetic. That wasn't strategy, she said. I know, I said. I've stopped narrating it. I'd come back with a map of the future and a list of everyone who'd wronged me, and I'd been right about all of it. Every scheme, every schemer, every receipt. Competence had done its job. The receipts had done theirs, and none of them, not one, had warned me about her.